August 17th, 1943, 0847 hours. Ball bearing factory, Schweinfurt, Bavaria. Obergefreiter Hans Weber cranked the elevation wheel on his 88 flak gun, tracking the distant specks approaching from the west. At first, they looked like a normal bomber formation, maybe 30 or 40 aircraft, manageable for his battery. Then, the horizon kept darkening. More bombers. Then more. The specks became a metal river flowing across the entire sky, stretching from north to south as far as he could see. Mein Gott, whispered his loader, Klaus Richter. The sky of metal. Weber had been firing flak since 1940, defending the fatherland against RAF night raids and occasional daylight attacks. He'd never seen anything like this. 376 B-17 flying fortresses in tight combat box formations, their aluminum bodies gleaming in the morning sun like a mechanized aurora. This wasn't about courage or marksmanship anymore. For German soldiers watching American bombers blot out their sky, the endless formations proved that the war had become a contest between German determination and American factories, and the factories were winning. The mathematics of industrial air power. By the summer of 1943, American aircraft production had achieved levels that German planners considered impossible. The Boeing Aircraft Company alone was producing B-17 flying fortresses at a rate of 16 aircraft daily at its Seattle facility. Consolidated Vultee added another dozen B-24 Liberators from plants in San Diego and Fort Worth. Douglas Aircraft contributed A-20 Havocs and C-47 transports from Santa Monica and Long Beach. The scale defied German comprehension. Each B-17 required 13,000 individual parts manufactured by 1,500 different suppliers across 47 states. Engines came from Wright Aeronautical in Ohio, turbo superchargers from General Electric in New York, bomb sights from Sperry Corporation in Brooklyn. The entire American industrial base had been mobilized to fill German skies with flying fortresses. The mathematics were overwhelming. American factories completed 4,735 B-17s in 1943 alone, with production accelerating monthly. Each bomber carried 10 aircrew members trained at facilities across the United States. Pilots from primary training fields in Texas and California, navigators from schools in Louisiana and Florida, bombardiers from bases in New Mexico and Colorado. German aircraft production, by contrast, peaked at 39,807 machines of all types in 1944. Fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers combined. A single American bomber type exceeded total German fighter production by substantial margins. The disparity extended beyond numbers to capabilities. Each B-17 carried 12.50 caliber machine guns with 11,000 rounds of ammunition, creating defensive firepower that required concentrated fighter attacks to penetrate. The Flying Fortress could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. Stories of B-17s returning to base with engines shot out, tail sections shredded, and entire sections of wing missing became legendary among both American crews and German defenders. The Luftwaffe's impossible task. Major Gunter Roll had shot down 275 enemy aircraft by August 1943, making him one of Germany's highest-scoring fighter pilots. His experience provided perspective on the magnitude of American bomber streams that younger pilots couldn't fully grasp. "We could destroy dozens of them," he testified after the war. "On a good day, perhaps we shot down 50 or 60 bombers. It felt like victory, until you realized they would return tomorrow with more aircraft than we had fighters to oppose them." The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, illustrated the mathematical impossibility facing German air defenses. The Luftwaffe scrambled approximately 300 fighters against 376 bombers escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts. German pilots flew multiple sorties, landing only to refuel and rearm before launching again. They shot down 60 American aircraft, a tactically significant number that would have devastated smaller formations. But the Americans kept coming. Wave after wave of silver bombers maintained formation despite fighter attacks and flak barrages. The sky remained filled with flying fortresses, even after German fighters had expended their ammunition and fuel. Lieutenant Dieter Hoffmann of JG-26 described the experience. "We attacked all morning, head-on passes, beam attacks, diving from above. We shot down many, but looking around the sky, you still saw nothing but American bombers. It was like trying to stop the ocean with a bucket." The ground perspective. From below, German soldiers and civilians witnessed aerial warfare on a scale that previous conflicts had never approached. The bomber streams stretched across the sky for minutes at a time, formation after formation passing overhead in precise, geometric patterns that demonstrated organizational capability beyond German experience. Feldwebel Karl Schreiber was on leave in Hamburg when the first 1,000-bomber raid struck the city on July 24, 1943. His unit had been fighting in Russia, where the largest air battles involved dozens of aircraft. Watching nearly 800 bombers approach Hamburg in broad daylight redefined his understanding of industrial warfare. "The sound came first," he wrote in a letter to his wife, "like thunder that never stopped. Then you saw them, silver dots filling the entire sky from horizon to horizon. More aircraft than I'd seen in 2 years of combat, all at once, all American." The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate terror of bombing. German soldiers realized they were confronting an enemy with resources that rendered traditional military calculations meaningless. How do you plan air defense against formations that outnumber your entire fighter force? How do you maintain morale when the enemy demonstrates such overwhelming material superiority? Anti-aircraft crews like Weber's found themselves fighting battles they couldn't win through skill or courage. The 88 flak guns were excellent weapons, capable of reaching 26,000 feet with deadly accuracy. But each gun could engage only one target at a time, and reloading required precious seconds, during which dozens of bombers passed through the engagement zone. The industrial spectacle. The sight of massed bomber formations became a daily demonstration of American industrial capacity that German propaganda couldn't explain away. Unlike night raids that occurred in darkness, American daylight bombing made the scale of enemy resources visible to entire populations. Factory worker Greta Hoffmann was cycling to her shift at a Messerschmitt plant when the bombers appeared overhead. "You stopped whatever you were doing and stared. Hundreds of them flying in perfect formation, their engines making music like the world's largest orchestra. Beautiful and terrible at the same time." The formations themselves represented organizational achievement that impressed even enemy observers. Flying 376 heavy bombers in tight formation across 600 miles of enemy territory required navigation, precision, communication discipline, and maintenance capability that demonstrated systematic excellence in every aspect of military aviation. Each bomber in the formation represented approximately $275,000 worth of equipment and training, over $4 million in current currency. The Schweinfurt raid alone put $103 million worth of aircraft and personnel over a single German city. The casual display of such wealth as an expendable resource sent a message about American industrial capacity that resonated throughout German military and civilian populations. The technology gap. American bomber technology incorporated innovations that German aircraft couldn't match despite their reputation for engineering excellence. The Norden bomb sight allowed precise targeting from altitudes where fighter interception was difficult. Turbo-supercharged engines maintained power at extreme altitudes. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small-caliber hits. Most importantly, American bombers were designed for mass production using techniques that German industry had never mastered. Standardized components, interchangeable parts, and assembly line manufacturing enabled production rates that skilled German craftsmen working on individually assembled aircraft couldn't approach. The B-17's defensive armament created particular problems for German fighter tactics. Previous bomber types had been vulnerable to attacks from specific angles, usually from below or behind. The Flying Fortress mounted machine guns in virtually every direction, creating overlapping fields of fire that made single-fighter attacks extremely dangerous. German pilots adapted by developing concentrated formation attacks that could overwhelm bomber defenses through sheer firepower. But these tactics required precise coordination and experienced pilots, resources that became increasingly scarce as the air war intensified. The escort evolution. The arrival of long-range escort fighters in 1944 transformed the bomber offensive from a costly battle of attrition into systematic destruction of German air power. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could accompany bombers deep into Germany, engaging Luftwaffe fighters over their own airfields. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. They had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers, accepting heavy losses in exchange for significant kills. Suddenly, they faced American fighters that outperformed German aircraft in speed, range, and climbing ability while maintaining numerical superiority. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, Germany's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, described the transformation. Before the Mustangs, we could choose when and where to attack the bombers. After they arrived, we fought for survival from takeoff to landing. The Americans controlled our sky. The escort fighters didn't just protect bombers. They actively hunted German fighters, attacking airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, and engaging in combat wherever they found opposition. German pilots found themselves defending their home bases while simultaneously trying to intercept bomber formations. The numbers game. By 1944, American bomber production had reached levels that made replacement of combat losses almost instantaneous. The Army Air Forces lost 4,754 heavy bombers during 1943, losses that would have crippled smaller air forces. American factories delivered 9,615 heavy bombers that same year, creating a net gain of nearly 5,000 aircraft despite combat attrition. German flak gunner Weber survived the war and testified about the psychological impact of facing endless American formations. You could shoot down plane after plane, but the formations never got smaller. If anything, they got larger. We realized we weren't fighting an air force, we were fighting American factories. The German aircraft industry, operating under constant bombing pressure and resource shortages, managed to produce impressive numbers of advanced fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. But German monthly fighter production of 1,000 aircraft couldn't offset American bomber production of 1,500, 2,000 heavy bombers plus fighters, transports, and training aircraft. The mathematics created a death spiral for German air defense. Each American bomber shot down was quickly replaced, but each German fighter lost represented irreplaceable pilot training and industrial capacity. Experienced German pilots who had survived years of combat found themselves overwhelmed by numerical superiority that no amount of skill could overcome. The Berlin Raids. The bombing of Berlin beginning in March 1944 brought the industrial air war to the Nazi capital, providing government officials and military leaders with direct experience of American bomber streams. The sight of hundreds of flying fortresses over the Reich Chancellery made abstract production statistics viscerally real. Oberst Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, watched from his office as B-17s droned overhead in broad daylight. At that moment, I knew the air war was lost. When the enemy can bomb our capital with impunity in daylight, when our fighters cannot prevent it despite desperate efforts, the mathematics of the situation become undeniable. The Berlin raids demonstrated American operational confidence that shocked German observers. Flying deep into enemy territory to bomb the enemy capital required absolute faith in numerical superiority and defensive capabilities. The Americans weren't just striking industrial targets, they were making political statements about which side controlled German airspace. Citizens in Berlin's streets watched formations that sometimes exceeded 1,000 bombers with fighter escorts. The spectacle was visible throughout the city. Office workers stopped at windows. Shoppers stood in streets. Children pointed skyward at formations that seemed to stretch forever. The civilian impact. German civilians experienced the bomber offensive as a daily demonstration of American industrial might that made resistance seem futile. The sight of endless formations crossing German skies contradicted propaganda claims about American weakness and German superiority. Berlin housewife Martha Klein kept a diary throughout the bombing campaign. Today the sky was dark with bombers again. I counted until I reached 200, then stopped because there were too many. Heinrich says each plane costs more than our house is worth. How can we fight such wealth? The economic implications were obvious to anyone with basic arithmetic skills. If Americans could afford to risk hundreds of expensive bombers on single missions, what did that suggest about their overall productive capacity? If they could replace losses faster than German fighters could inflict them, how could Germany hope to achieve air superiority? Children growing up during the bombing campaigns developed different perspectives on air warfare than their parents. To them, American bombers were simply part of the sky, as normal as clouds or birds. This generational shift in perception would influence post-war German attitudes toward American power and technology. The flak artillery response. German anti-aircraft defenses expanded dramatically in response to the bomber offensive, eventually employing over 1.2 million personnel in flak units across the Reich. The concentration of firepower around major cities created defensive barriers that inflicted significant losses on attacking formations. But even successful flak defenses couldn't cope with the scale of American attacks. Weber's battery around Schweinfurt included 12 88mm guns capable of firing 20 rounds per minute at optimal rates. Against formations of 300, 400 bombers, each gun could engage perhaps a dozen targets during the time formations remained in range. The mathematics were discouraging. Even perfect accuracy, impossible under combat conditions, couldn't bring down enough bombers to prevent successful attacks. German flak crews found themselves in situations where tactical success meant strategic failure. They could shoot down individual aircraft while watching entire formations complete their missions. Heavy flak guns required substantial resources that German industry couldn't spare. Each 88mm gun weighed nearly 7 tons and required specialized transportation, skilled crews, and constant ammunition supply. The steel and engineering expertise devoted to flak production reduced resources available for tank and aircraft manufacturing. The fighter pilot's dilemma. German fighter pilots faced impossible tactical situations when engaging large bomber formations. Attacking from head-on provided the best chance of inflicting damage before defensive fire became effective, but required precise timing and left no room for error. Pilots had approximately 2 seconds of firing time before collision became inevitable. Beam attacks from the side allowed longer engagement periods, but exposed fighters to concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers. Attacks from below provided some protection from defensive guns, but required climbing attacks that reduced speed and maneuverability. Every tactical approach carried enormous risks against formations that maintained disciplined defensive fire. German pilots developed techniques for concentrated attacks using entire squadrons, but these required experienced pilots flying in precise coordination, resources that became increasingly scarce as the air war intensified. Major Hans Philipp, commanding JG-1, was shot down and killed while attacking a B-17 formation in October 1943. His death symbolized the fate of German fighter aviation. Skilled pilots with excellent aircraft overwhelmed by numerical odds that no amount of individual courage could overcome. The production war. The contrast between American and German aircraft production revealed fundamental differences in industrial philosophy and capability. American factories emphasized quantity through standardization, while German manufacturers focused on quality through individual craftsmanship. Boeing's Seattle plant operated 3 shifts daily, producing B-17s on moving assembly lines that borrowed techniques from automobile manufacturing. Workers specialized in specific tasks, reducing training time and increasing efficiency. Standardized components allowed rapid assembly and simplified maintenance. German aircraft factories relied on skilled craftsmen who individually fitted components and adjusted systems for optimal performance. This approach produced excellent aircraft but couldn't achieve the production rates necessary for sustained warfare against American industrial capacity. The training pipeline demonstrated similar disparities. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of aircrew monthly from facilities across the United States. Flight schools operated continuously, producing pilots faster than combat could consume them. German training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and aircraft availability, couldn't replace experienced pilots lost in combat. The weather factor. American bombing operations continued regardless of weather conditions, demonstrating technological and organizational capabilities that German forces couldn't match. Instrument flying techniques, radar navigation, and formation procedures allowed bomber missions during conditions that would have grounded most air forces. The ability to operate in adverse weather multiplied the psychological impact of the bomber offensive. German defenders never knew when attacks might come. Clear days brought visual bombing missions, but overcast conditions often preceded radar-guided strikes that were equally effective. Weather forecasting and meteorological services supporting American operations exceeded German capabilities in scope and accuracy. Detailed weather data from across the Atlantic allowed mission planners to predict conditions over targets hours or days in advance, optimizing timing for maximum effectiveness. The Night and Day Campaign. The combination of American daylight bombing and British nighttime raids created a continuous offensive that exhausted German defenses and civilian populations. RAF Bomber Command attacked cities after dark, while the 8th Air Force struck industrial targets during daylight hours. This around-the-clock bombing campaign prevented recovery periods that might have allowed German defenses to reorganize or civilian populations to restore normal routines. Air raid sirens became constant features of German urban life, disrupting industrial production and undermining morale. The two-pronged offensive also complicated German defensive planning. Night fighters optimized for intercepting RAF bombers were less effective against daylight formations of B-17's flak defenses positioned for night attacks needed repositioning for daylight raids. Personnel and equipment couldn't be concentrated against either threat without exposing vulnerabilities to the other. The industrial target strategy. American bombing strategy focused on specific industrial choke points that would cripple German war production. Ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, and transportation networks. The precision required for such targeting demonstrated technological capabilities that exceeded German expectations. The Norden bomb site allowed accurate bombing from altitudes where fighter interception was difficult. Bombing accuracy improved throughout the campaign as crews gained experience and techniques were refined. By 1944, American bombardiers could place bombs within 1,000 feet of designated targets from altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. German industrial planners had never anticipated sustained precision bombing of critical facilities. The concentration of specialized production in single locations created vulnerabilities that American targeting exploited systematically. Destroying a single ball-bearing plant could affect production of thousands of aircraft, tanks, and other weapons systems. The morale effect. Beyond physical destruction, the bomber offensive created psychological effects that undermined German will to continue fighting. The sight of American formations crossing German skies with apparent impunity demonstrated that Nazi claims of military superiority were propaganda rather than reality. German soldiers on leave witnessed the bombing of their home cities, creating personal connections between military service and civilian suffering. The gap between propaganda promises and actual results became impossible to ignore when bombers flew overhead daily, while German fighters remained grounded for lack of fuel. Factory workers experienced bombing as validation of enemy power rather than motivation for greater effort. If Americans could afford to risk hundreds of expensive aircraft on single missions, what hope did German production have of matching such resources? The technical innovation race. American bomber development continued throughout the war, introducing new variants with improved defensive armament, longer range, and greater bomb capacity. The B-17G model featured a chin turret that eliminated the aircraft's main defensive vulnerability to head-on attacks. German fighter design responded with aircraft optimized for bomber interception, heavily armed variants that sacrificed maneuverability for firepower. The Focke-Wulf F-190A8 carried 420 mm SEM cannons and 2 machine guns, providing devastating hitting power against bomber formations. But technological improvements couldn't overcome numerical disadvantages. German pilots flying superior aircraft still faced impossible odds when attacking formations of hundreds of bombers escorted by long-range fighters. Individual technical excellence meant little when outnumbered 10-1 or 20-1. The end game. By the spring of 1945, American bomber formations encountered minimal opposition over German territory. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed through attrition that German industry couldn't replace. Fuel shortages grounded remaining aircraft, and experienced pilots had been killed or captured. The sight of unescorted bombers flying low over German cities demonstrated complete American air superiority. Formation discipline relaxed as the threat of interception disappeared. Bombing accuracy improved when aircraft could approach targets without defensive maneuvering. German soldiers and civilians witnessed the final collapse of their air defense system with mixed emotions. Relief at the end of bombing was tempered by recognition that German military resistance had become pointless. The sky belonged entirely to the Allies,